The agenda this week scrutinized the race to lead the Conservative Party of Canada, toured urban Ontario circa 1867, and zeroed in on climate change as a global security risk. The agenda's week in review begins with the future of NAFTA.
I think we have diversified over the last 40 years. We do a lot more business because of the growth of emerging markets, China and all of Southeast Asia. We've been shipping a lot more raw materials to those jurisdictions. What I find really interesting is a study that one of our colleagues did a few years ago, Doug Porter at BMO. He did it for McDonald Laurier, and he showed that pre and post NAFTA, we went from 17% of our GDP being shipped to the United States before NAFTA. It peaked in 2001 at 33%. A third of everything we produced got shipped to the United States. And now we're back down to 19%. He wrote that in 2012. It's been flat since 2012. And this is partly global trade growing, but then again, flattening out. This has been the problem with sloth around the world, is we just can't get our mojo back in terms of trading. Slow or no growth.
Okay.
We've been worried about, serial disappointments, I think is the phrase that the Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz uses, is that we keep expecting this falling Canadian dollar to pick up the export-led growth. It's not materializing because trade around the world is slowing because of these increasing protectionist sentiments. And I think that's where we have to go back to. Do we have enough trade with the United States or someplace else? Really what's happening is a backlash against export-led growth being the only type of growth that governments seem to want to pursue instead of wage-led growth, domestic-led growth. And I think that's a friction that we're at some kind of pivot point here in talking about what are governments there to do, just support exporters or to support their own citizens.
What do you see in terms of the overarching play that the United States is trying to do right here? We see what's happening on softwood lumber now, right? The fifth time this thing has come around. We see that President Trump is now targeting the dairy producers, particularly in central Canada. And we can add, now we've seen the coal issue get swept up in the British Columbia election in the dying days of that campaign, as the Premier of British Columbia, who wants re-election, obviously, tries to bring that into play. What's the bigger theme that's happening here south of the border?
Well, it picks up a little bit with what Armin was just talking about, right? What we have is an increase of nationalism and protectionism, and it's a backlash because many people have not benefited from the economic growth that we've had. Even with slow growth, some people have been left behind. And I think part of it's a misdiagnosis. There's a lot of complaints about globalization. I actually think it's technical change that's having the bigger impact. For every job that's been disrupted through globalization, 4 or 5 have probably been disrupted through technical change.
So it's automation, basically.
So it's automation in the manufacturing sector, for example, has had a bigger impact than probably anything else in terms of the labor market outcomes.
You wouldn't know that because the politicians tend to focus on like Trump says, this trade agreement's a disaster. He doesn't talk about automation.
Well, and that's where I think part of the misdiagnosis is, right? So I think Trump's basic focus is on the loss of U.S. jobs to low wage countries. We talked a lot about Mexico and China, but when it comes to Canada, there has been longstanding trade disputes with Canada around supply management and around softwood lumber. These things are not new, and they actually precede the Trump administration. I do think Canada got put back in the crosshairs in recent weeks when Trump was approaching the end of his 100 days and hadn't really appeared to accomplish much. And he really wanted to reiterate a couple of the core things that he ran on. We got a big statement around his tax reduction, dramatic tax reduction policy, but he also went after Canada around supply management. And we had an announcement from the Department of Commerce on softwood. So again, this fits into the broader narrative. I still think that ultimately we're going to end up in NAFTA negotiations. The real question is going to be, what sort of engagement does the new administration have with us on trade? I think there's a lot of scope to improve NAFTA and actually make it better for Canada, the United States, and Mexico if we could have a constructive dialogue. What I'm worried about is whether the conversation is going to be constructive or whether it's just going to be one-sided.
Well, let me follow up with you on that, because all of the complaining that we're hearing about NAFTA these days comes stateside and it's all about how the U.S. is getting job because of this deal, and they want it renegotiated, but on terms that are more favorable to them. Can you imagine a situation where we renegotiate this treaty and get improvements for us?
No, not really. I can't actually see that. Not with this administration, which is not about getting a deal for everybody. It's about getting a deal for the U.S. and to be seen clearly as having screwed somebody else to be able to get those benefits. But I do want to go back to this idea that people don't understand how they're being screwed, that they're actually being screwed by the machines rather than by low-wage workers, because, you know, we call it deindustrialization. It means that the Industrial Revolution is going to lower wage places. And I remember getting my first job in 1987, still dealing with the deindustrialization of the Toronto labor market and what that meant for people, what it meant for the men that lost the jobs and their women who took much lower paying jobs, women that hadn't traditionally been in the labor market. I think about Caterpillar in London.
And just so we're clear, that means that within the city of Toronto, we stopped making stuff. Is that what you mean?
Fridges, stoves, cereal, tires. It just went on and on and on until we stopped being a manufacturing center. And we're seeing that, I mean, it is happening in the United States, where you've got now half of the United States that are now right-to-work states. Employers are going overseas because it improves their profit margins to go someplace where they can produce these things cheaper. And people are really nervous about, if I can afford a cheaper thing, that's cool. But if I don't have a job at all, I can't afford that cheaper thing.
I do think, though, that it's important to remember that we're talking about Ontario in 1867, but nobody in Ontario in that period really thought of themselves as Ontarians. They barely thought of themselves as Canadians. Although we'd had Confederation was sort of on the horizon, if not just being celebrated, these were still little colonies that had joined together as provinces, and they were filled with people who identified themselves by their origins or their religion. So that there were Yankees, they were Irish, they were English, they were Protestants, French-speaking Canadians in Ontario, and it was a fractious, fragmented, incoherent society with no sense of being loyal to the province particularly, let alone the country.
Well, let's get you to follow up if we can. I want to hear more about the city that you find yourself in right now. The nation's capital, you know, hadn't been the nation's capital for all that long. What did the city look like?
Well, it had been the nation's capital for just over 10 years, and it had these marvelous Gothic Parliament buildings, which gave a sense of the big ambitions for the future. But if you stood on Parliament Hill and looked around you, you'd see two things. One would be the immense wealth of this land, as at this time of year, the logging rafts came thundering down the Ottawa River and the Gatineau River. And the other was how the capital, in fact, was really nothing more than a jumped-up lumber town, and pretty squalid at that. In amongst the public buildings, whether we're talking about the Parliament buildings or the convents or the churches, in amongst those buildings, there were just sort of clapboard shacks, and it was pretty ghettoized. There were the Irish and French Roman Catholics in Lower Town. There were the Protestants around the canal. It was actually not a city that I would have enjoyed at all then. One of the comments from many of the public servants who had to move here when it was made the capital, and they were pretty upset at having to move here from Quebec City, which they'd been living in previously, was how bad this place smelt. It smelt of the lumber mills, which smells like cabbage, and they hadn't yet laid any drains.
Victoria, I want to ask you, actually having just come out of the city that the Queen of the same name as you chose to be our capital, let's ask you about the other capital, namely Toronto, capital of the province of Ontario. How'd that look back in 1867?
Well, I can speak mostly to what had happened in terms of Indigenous people in Toronto. So the Mississaugas had been basically forced out of their, crowded out of their territories on the Credit River, which was then not exactly part of Toronto, but on the periphery of Toronto. And they had been unable to get title to their lands. So there's the whole question of the Toronto Purchase. And I would mention that in terms of Ottawa as well.
Tell us what the Toronto Purchase was.
So the Toronto Purchase was in 1787. It was some sort of agreement between the British and the Mississaugas. But it was very improperly recorded. The boundaries were not spelled out. And even the very next year, it was in question when the surveyors attempted to survey the land.
So this is why Premier Wynne, whenever she gives a speech in public in this city, always starts with, she wants to acknowledge she's on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the New Credit.
And that land claim was only settled in 2010.
In 2010?
In 2010, yes. So
long time after.
Yeah.
Okay, let's look at, can we bring this picture up here, Sheldon? This is the Humber River Valley. It's not 1867, but it's 1919. Hunting grounds. This is quite something. Heidi, people went hunting in the Humber River Valley in 1919?
Absolutely. Again, much of what's now housing development in Toronto, of course, was pasture land, woodlot, because many people burned wood, and those places were ecosystems. The ravine system was full of animals. We still have deer coming into the Don Valley today.
Indeed,
we
indeed.
do, but much more then. So of course people went hunting within the city and fishing where they could. But the Don River was damaged early on and lost. Atlantic salmon used to run up the Don River.
Now the big street I gather in Toronto at the time was King Street. So let's take a look at that one if we can. Bring up that shot. That's bustling. I mean, not even a road really.
Well, it's dirt.
It's dirt,
and you
right.
can imagine in the summertime with the rain, in the springtime and the fall with the rains, the kinds of conditions you would be driving in your carriage with your horses.
We've talked about Ottawa, the capital of the country. We've talked about Toronto, the capital of the province. I want to add another capital to our list here, and that is the capital city before Ottawa. Once upon a time was Kingston.
That's right.
And you know, before we were actually Canada, we were the United Provinces of Canada, it was the capital for a few years once upon a time. What was it like back in the 19th century?
Much smaller. Toronto, of course, was Confederation was 50,000 people. I think Kingston around Confederation was around 12 or 13,000. So much smaller place. But still having been a seat of government, still having a little more tone, as you might say, than some of the other towns of equivalent size in other parts of the province.
Charlotte, of those three cities we've mentioned, yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say Queen's University had already been founded, and Kingston had some very impressive public buildings because it did have pretensions to being the capital for the rest of eternity. So it had not just a wonderful cathedral in the start of its university, but also a marvelous city hall in which the Parliament had originally met.
And fair to say then that therefore Kingston was the most, and I use this word I guess in inverted commas, sophisticated city in Ontario of the time?
I'm sure it would like to have described itself that way, but I think that the sort of Chamber of Commerce mentality was at large in many of these communities, whether we're looking at Kingston or Hamilton. There was a sense that you know, these were communities that were going to grow. The railways the little local railways were starting to make a real difference and give people a sense that they were going to have wider trading opportunities and therefore would become wealthier.
What if Bernier wins, and what if he decides in his wisdom that the position of his Conservative Party of Canada is going to be, okay, we're obliged to transfer X number of dollars every year to provinces to deal with health care. We'll do that. Spend the money how you want. Period, full stop. Why would that be so complicated?
Well, part of the issue, I think, is that when you're in any level of government, you get lobbied to do things for people who want you to do them, so you will support them. So how many times have we heard people calling for a national health strategy in mental health, or a national strategy in this kind of health?
Yeah, lots of time. And his answer will be, it's a provincial responsibility. Don't come to me. Knock on Kathleen Wynne's door.
Right. I love it.
Well, more particularly, and I think he has dealt with this, is he's going to convert what are now cash transfers that the two levels of government fight over every year into tax points. So the provinces will get as much or more money, but it'll be their money, and therefore they'll have to be accountable for it to their taxpayers. He's hardly alone in arguing for that. I've seen think tank reports arguing with this for 30 years.
So it's a perfectly defensible position.
It's a perfectly defensible position. I want to come back to Mark's point, though, which is it seems to be two routes traditionally to power. One is what was described is, what do you want to hear? I'll tell you what you want to hear. And you hope that you can put together enough of those things. The other is you start off with a firmly defined political philosophy, and then you discover the ways in which you've got to temper that and moderate that to broaden your base. And they can each win, I think.
Yes,
it depends on the qualities of the candidates. One of the things I think, if we're talking about Bernier, that he's got going for him is, yes, he's got, I would say, quite a radical platform. I don't mean radical in a bad sense, but just in the sense that it implies large changes. Yeah. But I think, as I say, in most cases they come from perfectly impeccable pedigrees in terms of expert opinion. It's just they're new to public opinion. But he's also got a likability factor, and that is when you see those two things together in politics, it's often quite golden. I don't want to make exaggerated comparisons, but that was the Reagan formula, right? Is likability plus radical policies. I think the concern about him is, does he have the depth and the judgment? Does he have the leadership qualities beyond that? And I'm still a little nervous about that, although I will say he and his team have run a very good campaign.
Yes,
there's a reason why he's come from
in first place.
He's come from, a small business and tourism minister to,
Yeah, well, the other advantage that he has, which really makes it, I think is really important in politics, is the policy positions he's putting out there are his policy positions. Yes. They resonate with him.
And there's no mistaking that.
No, and he's been consistent.
He's authentic on that.
He's very authentic. And I think a lot of us have followed politicians over the years or voted for people over the years that you don't necessarily agree with everything that they're putting forward, but if it's sort of well thought out, if it's authentic, if it makes sense to them, they're not just doing it because somebody stuck their finger in the wind, that is also attractive. And you can follow people you may not even agree with.
Most people are not very ideological or partisan.
That's right.
And it's true that they're looking for moderation, but I think the mistake that people in my profession, maybe people in politics do, is to think that the moderation means just mushy policies. I think what most people are looking for is moderation of tone and temperament. Whatever your policies are, they want to know that you've thought them through, that you could be persuaded by contrary evidence, that you could compromise if you had to, that that you're an adult.
But here's what I want to know. Mark, when push comes to shove, and I'll give you the example, I think you were there actually in Mayor Ford's office when there were negotiations with the federal government for hundreds of millions of federal contribution dollars to building a subway in Scarborough, and Jim Flaherty, may he rest in peace, came forward with that money. Maxime Bernier is saying, those days, if I'm in charge, are gone. Don't look for a federal government contribution for big infrastructure, public works, public transit projects. I mean, can that really sell in the big cities of this country?
It'll be very hard. If he could win government and become prime minister, then he could probably execute on that. But how do you get votes in Toronto and say we're not coming to the table with money? How do you get votes in Alberta without saying we're not going to do, enact policies that are good for you? How do you get votes in Quebec if you don't protect the type of transfers that they're used to?
Part of what you're saying is then we don't want what I consider to be a pure small c conservative government, and I disagree with that. And I do think that his policies are both, as I said, small c conservative. I think we should never underestimate Janet's point, which is if they don't believe them,
that's right.
We should not be electing this person as leader. Because you can't fake it. There's no doubt about that. So I do think that you can say, this is what we're going to do, this is what the provinces are going to do, and this is what the municipalities are going to do.
All right, let me follow up with Janet. You've obviously been in charge of the books of the province when you were Minister of Finance. Is it possible to build a $4 billion subway in Scarborough, for example, if the federal government decides it doesn't want to make a contribution to that kind of a project?
Well, certainly with the revenue tools that cities have, no. I mean, the property tax, which is one of their major sources of revenue, it would be very difficult for them to do those kinds of major projects with that revenue. So you'd have to open up a whole, for the provinces, and yes, tax points or whatever.
But I think the province would still be involved, and in my view, the province should be involved in transit. One of the problems we've had here in Toronto is that we have thought about transit from a municipal perspective, and we've not gone more broadly speaking.
I agree with that.
To me, like a very old-fashioned argument. We are in an age when we've got the federal Liberals setting up an infrastructure bank to finance things with private capital and user pay. We've got John Tory, of all people, talking about road tolls until Kathleen Wynne slapped him down. So the notion that everything has to be financed, first of all, by government rather than by private capital or user pay, I think is a little bit old-fashioned. And secondly, you're absolutely right. Obviously, he or whoever is leader has to have policies that appeal to people in the cities, but I don't equate that with federal funding of transit. Right. As a general rule, and I think he does have to situate this in a larger philosophical framework, is we have had far too much of one level of government begging for funds from another level. We have so many people who get elected, no offense to anybody here, who get elected in politics in this country by promising to beg from another level of government or to demand from another level. And it blurs accountability.
It works every time,
well, unfortunately, it can play often too often, but it blurs accountability. It perpetuates this kind of nasty finger-pointing type of politics. And yeah, if we could get to a system where each level of government funded itself from its own tax base, surely that's progress. And I agree that the cities need a different tax base, but let's talk about that rather than who can beg the best.
The overwhelming consensus is we are facing a massive risk. Climate change is happening. We've got to decide whether they're going to act on it or not. And that choice has consequences.
The Age of Consequences, Saturday night on TVO. Sherry, I want to start with you because you are in this documentary, and I want you to give us a better sense about how you managed to get climate change on the U.S. military's radar screen. Help us with that.
Well, thank you very much, Steve. I served in the Defense Department in the 1990s when we were just becoming aware of the impact of climate change on military activities. And 10 years ago, I formed a group called the CNA Military Advisory Board, comprised of a dozen senior retired military leaders, where we undertook with the nation's leading climate scientists in both the United States and the UK at the time to really understand the science of climate change and its impact on military operations and military strategy. And we concluded from our year-long work that climate change is indeed a threat multiplier for instability in fragile regions of the world, and in fact is affecting us even in stable regions. We see it happening today. It's a real risk, and it's one that we need to include into our defense planning, our strategy, and all of our exercises and activities.
Okay, a bunch of follow-ups before we get the others involved here. First of all, you used that expression, threat multiplier. What does that mean?
Well, it means it takes any threat we have today. For example, take the conflict in Syria. Underlying that conflict is a long-term drought that exacerbated conditions in that region and made it more likely that populations would be at risk and that there would be conflict because there's inadequate food, water, and resources for the population. There is a direct correlation between that long-term drought and the rise of instability in the region. We see the same thing across the Arab Spring countries, where the Arab Spring uprisings in Egypt and Tunisia were preceded by drought across the wheat-producing countries of China and Russia and Ukraine. Russia, in fact, stopped the export of wheat just months before the Arab Spring uprisings. And that food shortage was a spark that lit the match that led to the Arab Spring uprisings. So we see now that climate change is affecting us across the Asia-Pacific region in Disaster Alley, where extreme weather events are occurring more intensely and more frequently, to sea level rise at military installations in the United States, to increased ocean temperatures, heat temperatures. And so we see this as a magnifying force for the instability that we face from other very real threats, such as terrorism and weapons of mass destruction.
Okay, and one more follow-up, Sherry, and that is how open, as you tried to get the military to take this issue seriously, how open, in your view, was the military to doing just that?
Well, at first there was indeed some skepticism about, this is just an environmental issue. But in fact, the great thing about military leaders is that they're serious and they take risks and threats seriously. So any risk to their operation, whether it's a health threat, has to be accounted for. And so, you evaluate the level of that risk and the likelihood that it's going to affect your ability to conduct a military operation or carry out a military strategy. And so As we got into this, it became abundantly clear that those risks are rising. In the Cold War, we spent billions of dollars of U.S. GDP to deter what we perceived to be the major threat of that era, a bolt out of the blue nuclear attack by the Soviet Union. Fortunately, we were successful, and the Cold War ended. That was a high threat, but low probability risk. High consequence, low probability. With climate change, we arguably have a higher probability and equally high consequence threat that is approaching us right now. It's time for us to act.
Okay, David Morley, let me get you into the conversation now. I'd like you to help us understand about the disproportionate impact that climate change can have on some of the most vulnerable population in the world, and I'm talking, of course, about children. Fill us in on that, please.
Well, Steve, there's no question that climate change puts many children at risk. First of all, there's the numbers. There's more than 150 million children who are in drought-prone areas and 500 million children who are in areas that are prone to flooding. And both of those can have very serious consequences, because when there's a drought, when children don't get enough food, just as Sherry was saying, what food shortages mean for children can have a lifelong impact. If children don't get enough to eat, they become malnourished. If they're malnourished for a couple of years, that's going to have a lifelong impact. As adults, we could make it through that. But if you're a child and it's, say, between the ages of 4 and 6, you go without enough food, that's going to have a lifelong impact. And if you're living in a flood-prone area and floods come, that usually means waterborne diseases. And again, it's the poorest people, it's the most vulnerable people who are living in these places that are most likely to have floods, and many who don't have the capability to respond to droughts either. So that when droughts come, inflation comes in, food gets more expensive, and that means that there's less to eat as well for those children. So, you know, we talk about, Sherry knows about the military side of it. For us at UNICEF, what we see is that children are at risk, and that puts families at risk, and that's a way of putting whole societies at risk.
And that is the Agenda's Week in Review for this Friday, May 12th, 2017. You can see all of those conversations in their entirety on our website at tvo.org, on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/theagenda, and now, thanks to our nightly Twitter live stream, on our Periscope page at periscope.tv/theagenda.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit tvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.